Welcome everybody to the interview series of the Houston Center, the Houston Center for Humanity and Common Good. I'm the director, Jens Zimmermann, a professor of theology here at Regent College. And just to remind our viewers, the Houston Center is dedicated to reflecting on human identity and what it means to flourish in human society. And today is our privilege to have Paul Nedelisky as our guest. Paul is Assistant Director and a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies of Culture at the University of Virginia, also an interdisciplinary think tank that aims to understand the deep structures of cultural change and culture's impact on common life. And we want to talk about some of the interesting ideas you put forward in two respects. One, you have co-authored with James Davison Hunter a book, Science and the Common Good, that we want to talk about and discuss a little bit. And the other is you have, after this, you have a new project, which you call, I just have to get the title right, The Engines of the Zeitgeist, which is roughly, I think, about secularization, morality, and the emergence of a kind of new moral culture.
That's right.
Which is a fascinating thesis that I think our viewers will be interested in learning more about. But what we usually do before we talk about these details is we'd like to hear a little bit about your formation, intellectual formation. How did you come to be interested in these themes through your education or your upbringing, or how you were formed that way?
Yeah, Jens, thank you. It's a generous question. And first of all, thank you for having me up to Regent and to the Houston Center and for the interview.
It's a pleasure.
It's a delight. I think it started for me both sort of my intellectual interest in these sorts of things and my more particular interest in science from a small youth group that I attended when I was in high school. It started when I was 14 or 15. It was led by a man who was actually most of the time a missionary in Ecuador named Steve Saint. And it was an unusual youth group in that the teenagers would gather, and then Steve would just talk about whatever was on his mind for about an hour and a half, a very long time, it felt back then. And then we would discuss it. And one day, he had apparently read this book by Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box.
Oh, yeah.
And he introduced the idea of irreducible complexity to the youth group. And most people zoned out, but I had never heard anything like this before, and I was fascinated. And a close friend of mine and I listened with rapt attention through the whole thing, and then I went out and bought the book and started thinking about, sort of in this context of intelligent design and the creation science debates was where I first became interested in some of these things, but it broadened into Darwinism and philosophy of science. And then eventually, after my degree in philosophy, I had a chance to work on this project with James Hunter, and to my surprise, an actual opportunity to work on science and philosophy presented itself. I'd always assumed I'd have to wait until I had tenure or something, and then I could work on it. So that's sort of part of the intellectual development, going back to that happenstance, or I guess providential topic in the youth group long ago. Mm-hmm. But also, James Hunter has been a huge influence, an intellectual mentor. Working with him at the Institute over the years has been key. I could name a bunch of other people, but that's some of the main points I would say.
Talk about other people. I forgot to introduce John Nolan, who collaborates with me on the center as research assistant and overall does everything and is intensely interested in these kind of topics. And you have known John for a while.
That's true.
Quite some time.
Since 2007.
Almost 20 years, yeah.
That's right. To get back to the book, so again, I'll just hold this up, Science and the Good. If I can summarize this, correct me if this is not right, but you're basically charting the rise of a kind of science of morality. Can you just say something about that? And the question is basically, can science tell us what morality is and how to live well or morally proper? And I think the answer you give in the book is basically no, it can't.
Definitely no.
Which may be surprising to some of us nowadays. We're so used that science can do and technology can do a whole number of things. Why not measure determine what it is to be moral and so on and so forth. But to you and your co-author, it's a basic no. Can you say more about that? How you
Sure
arrived there?
Right. I think part of the instigation of the project was at the time that we started writing, we were in the midst of kind of a renaissance of books about the science of morality. Between like 2005, 2015, there was just a ton of publishing on this question. A lot of books coming out where people working in kind of the intersection of philosophy and science were saying, science can show us how to live. Science can answer moral questions. Science can reveal the good. And James and I both thought this can't be right. What's going on here? And James was able to find an opportunity for us to work on this project together, got a book contract, and so we launched into it, reading this literature, trying to figure out what was going on. And just to kind of give a quick overview of the project, and then come back to your question of why does this appeal to some people? What we found in digging into this and tracing back the history was that the question really began basically at the dawn of modernity, in the wars of religion, when for centuries Christianity was the moral basis of culture in Europe. And starting with the Reformation and the reaction to the Reformation and the political unrest that capitalized on these dogmatic disputes, there were a number of religious wars that were very violent, that really worried a lot of people, especially intellectuals. Well, not just especially, but they were writing things down about it. And a lot of the thinkers at the time blamed Christianity and religion more generally for the conflict. Religion cannot settle these issues. It's no longer a good foundation for the moral order, as we see from all these wars that were so violent. What could play this role instead to provide stability in society? And at the time this was happening, the scientific revolution was also beginning. So there was a clear, it seemed, kind of obvious answer. And so many of the thinkers said, oh, well, science can play this role. From that time onward, basically, in many different starts and stops, different incarnations of the project in the intervening centuries, people have said, well, science seems to be the way to go. Science can resolve moral questions in the same way it resolves questions about the physical sciences. We no longer disagree about the force of gravity, whether the Earth is at the center of the universe. Science has provided these questions that demonstrated the answers. Maybe it can do the same for morality. And part of what James and I did was say, well, let's see. Let's try to find what answers were uncovered in these last 400 years. And the results are not very encouraging because there hasn't been anything. There have been a lot of bold claims, lofty expectations, but in the end, the best that any of these sciences of morality have been able to do is tell us something about aspects of society or culture or the human mind that connect to the moral realm somehow, but like in a contingent or accidental way, or in a way that doesn't really tell us what's right and wrong. So maybe there's in the recent neuroscience, we can tell where blood flow is most intense when we think about moral questions, and that's interesting and may have implications.
Brain imaging.
Brain imaging, yeah. And it turns out, it's a different area for consequentialist reasoning versus deontological. Maybe that tells us something about difference in the thoughts. Who knows? But these kinds of results tell us related things, but they don't tell us anything about what is right and wrong. And so then James and I said, well, why is that? What's the barrier? Why haven't we figured it out? Why no results? And where we came down is the thought that it seems that there's kind of something like the uncertainty principle in physics that is a challenge for a science of morality. What is it? The answer you can know the position, or you can know the velocity, but not both at the same time. It's something like that. With the science of morality, you can have moral concepts that are adequate to the phenomenon you're trying to study. They capture truths about the moral realm. About we're going to use goodness. We're going to use the terms about duty and obligation or virtue, but then you can't empirically demonstrate them because these phenomena can't be detected in that way, Or conversely, you can say, well, we're going to redefine moral terms in ways that make them empirically detectable. We're going to define goodness as promoting the survival of the species or maximizing pleasure. And then this becomes more empirical. But then if you do that, it becomes unclear to everyone who's interested in the subject whether you're really talking about the good, whether you're really talking about morality. So this is the barrier that presents itself at a philosophical level, and why the project hasn't succeeded.
And have scientists realized, I mean, when you tell the tale like this, it seems clear to me that you've just used, like, that instrument cannot be used for what they want to use it for. Right? I mean, the instrument of objectifying science simply is inadequate for, it's like trying to use a hammer to open a can of tuna or something, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
Maybe that's not even good because eventually you could smash it,
Right.
but you know what I mean? It's a completely inadequate instrument. Was there any point in which scientists began to reflect on the fact that that's the case, or what happened? Or did they redefine what morality is in the end in order to continue this project? Or?
I think plenty of scientists recognize that the project is futile, and many philosophers have too. I think that there's something unique to the modern era where we want to settle disagreements, to live together in pluralism, and science is such an attractive and alluring possibility that we keep coming back to it even though it can't work. I like we're using the wrong tool. A metaphor that I tried to use when we were writing the book was brushing your teeth with a hammer. But it was
Yes.
regarded as too violent, so we had to take that out. But it's the same kind of idea. Like, this is not an apt tool for the task at hand. There was, related to this point, something that we had no idea we were going to run across when we began the project, but it eventually emerged from the research, was this kind of twist or turn that the literature or the project of the science of morality has taken in the last maybe 20 years. And that is some of the most recent moral scientists, if you really press them or you read all of their written works, what you find out is they don't really see themselves as uncovering an objective moral realm. They don't think that such a realm exists. They're what I would call they're philosophical naturalists. They think whatever is real has to be the kind of thing you could describe with the terms of empirical science. And so anything that can't be described in that way is chimerical. It's not real. It doesn't exist.
Right.
And so they don't think the good is really out there, or that there really are moral obligations. But they would, if you ask them about this, they say, yeah, but we still have to do something. We have to decide as a society or as an individual one option over another. And moral language is helpful in that context. But what we really are talking about is achieving goals, which is an amoral way of thinking about it, because your goals could be good or they could be bad. But when the new moral scientists envision a moral science, that's what what they have in mind is using a technical scientific approach to problem solving, or how can we engineer the outcome that we want. And that is a more suitable use of science than uncovering the good, which it cannot do. But it's a change of subject. It's kind of a not well advertised change in what the...
Kind of a sleight of hand, almost.
I think so.
Yeah.
And at first I was really... I took it personally.
Yeah.
I thought they know what they're doing it on purpose. But fortunately, I was working with a cultural sociologist who helped me understand. No, they're just speaking from the subcultures they're a part of, which are broadly speaking meritocratic and instrumentalist. It's about achievement, and so.
Just to, I think it goes without saying that obviously we're deeply sympathetic to and in agreement with the fundamentals of the project. Just to play devil's advocate a bit, I suppose I could hear somebody saying, well, science in the 17th century couldn't achieve certain things that it can achieve now, right? The scientific method and our various practices and tools that we do have developed such that we can produce, I don't know, AI or whatever, take your pick. But what you're saying is there's something fundamental about the moral realm that we should not hold the expectation that given enough time, our scientific instruments will be able to produce these kinds of results. Can you say a little bit more about that?
That's a great question, because this is what many people in the more recent moral science literature say. When the point is raised, look, we've been trying this for hundreds of years and we haven't gotten anywhere. It's like, yeah, but look at the technological advances, especially neuroscience. Like when brain imaging became a reality, the hopes were very high. Like, oh, now we're going to unlock the secrets of the mind, and it's gonna all just fall into place.
Right.
And it hasn't. But that story is an interesting one. Joshua Green, Fiery Cushman, Jonathan Haidt, they attempted this project, and they did uncover some interesting things, but in their attempt to make it a moral science, they always wound up smuggling in philosophical assumptions that prevented it from really being an empirical, demonstrative discovery of anything moral that was really the gold standard if we could do it.
Yeah, and that's just kind of an unavoidable terminus. Eventually, those kinds of commitments are going to come into the fold.
Yeah, I think because it's we're dealing with a metaphysical impossibility. The example we use in the book, and it gets back to the inadequate tool metaphor you're using. The example we used was trying to find driftwood with a metal detector on the beach. Doesn't matter how good the detecting of metal gets, there's no metal in the driftwood, so you're never going to be able to detect it.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
I mean, not wanting to sound, superior or arrogant, but I mean, if you're well familiar with the long discourse, ever since people started to reflect on themselves, in ancient philosophy on these things, the fundamental problem here would be to equate the mind with the brain, for instance, I mean, that's been a question that's been asked in Stoic philosophy, like way back, and you can see it in some of the patristics writing we were studying. What is the soul? What is the brain? What's the mind? Is the mind the brain? That was a long-standing discussion. They said, it can't possibly be. Well, here are these modern scientists who made that decision, and therefore they get all excited about, well, if that's the case, then we can obviously measure brain activity and therefore somehow get at morality. Right, so that seems to be one. The other element that you mentioned in the book, I wanted to hear more about, because it seems to me it also feeds into our current culture, is the reduction of morality to pleasure and pain. Can you say more about that? I think that's a bit part of the history that you chart. I think that seems to me huge, because if that's the case, then things like suffering, that used to be part of the educational enterprise within Christianity and also other ancient cultures, right? That forms you, how you cope with suffering. I mean, that's no longer part of morality now. That's something to be utterly avoided, let's say.
That's a great observation, and I only have a very little bit to say. I would enjoy hearing your thoughts on this, because you're right. One stage of the history of the science of morality was sort of the utilitarian turn, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, with Bentham. Bentham was drawing on some earlier French and Italian work, but the hope that you can get rid of duties, you can get rid of virtue, because who can detect these things? It's just people imposing their opinions. But what you can tell is if someone is suffering or in a state of ecstasy, it's at least quasi-empirical. And so if you make ethics all about what maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain, then we have something like a calculus, something that seems pretty empirically tractable. But so much has to be left out. And you're right. The utilitarian response to the kind of character development line, I think, would be, well, in the end, you maximize pleasure by enduring moments of pain. But I think that's changing the terms of the discussion. I would guess, I haven't thought or studied much on this, but I would guess that the project of formation of character is not oriented toward ultimately the maximization of pleasure. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are going toward the way of using drugs and medication or information implantation or something like that circumvents the whole idea of having to cope with or go through, and it doesn't. So the end of it is not necessarily a pleasure, but a growth and maturity and tolerance, which seems to be slightly different. It's a non-measurable kind of a thing, which was the basis of education for a long, long time. And I know from friends in psychiatry that the trend goes more towards these technological solutions. Right? So why would you want a patient put up with depression to some degree, or put up with some kind of condition and try to master it through change in diet, change in practices, rather than not that that's ruled out, right? But rather than just simply popping pills, or better yet, as technology advances, have brain implants or brain stimuli, or do it technologically, instead of having the person, him or herself, being able to master that out of her own resources. And that's completely gone by the wayside. It goes more and more in treatment towards the technological. And the hope is then more and more into technology as it develops.
Yeah.
And then eventually we will just not educate, we'll just download information.
Like Neo in the Matrix.
Yeah.
I know Kung Fu.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Sure. Paul, you mentioned that the bulk of this literature that you and James Hunter are responding to was published roughly between 2005 and 2015. Can you give us a sense of what some of these, for one thing, who are some of these major authors who can kind of contributed to this body of literature, and two, what are they up to now?
It's a great question. So some of the big names that were active when we were writing are Joshua Green.
Mm-hmm. And he's the author of Moral Tribes.
Moral Tribes, that's right, yeah. An interesting project. Jonathan Haidt, Patricia Churchland, Owen Flanagan, Paul Thagard, Steven Pinker, Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the big names.
Right. And just to be clear, I mean, when you mention people like Steven Pinker and Sam Harris, this isn't a fringe phenomenon, right? These are people with pretty substantial followings, or at least at the time they had substantial followings.
That's true. And my sense is that this literature, it wasn't fringe because in the sense that it was getting plenty of readership. I think these books sold well as far as academic books do, especially Sam Harris's books. But this project has always been kind of on the fringes of the academic disciplines. So it's not really at home in philosophy. It's not really at home. I mean, the cognitive sciences would be the best place to situate them. Mm-hmm. But most of these people are actually philosophers. Some exceptions would be Jonathan Haidt, but most of them have degrees in philosophy.
Yeah. Like
Joshua Green, his degrees in philosophy, even though he works in the psychology department at Harvard. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, or Princeton rather. But so these are some of the big names. What have they been up to since then? I haven't checked on all of them, but my sense is that the interest in this literature is in a trough right now. It's kind of waned, and I'd like to think it's because James and I settled all the issues and science the good, but I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I think it was contingent social stuff. I think part of it, a lot of this was motivated by the same forces that were buoying the new atheism, and that movement has kind of subsided. There was a shared rhetoric between this recent science of morality literature and the new atheism, in that there was an optimism about rational debate, in a sense that there were shared terms and that there was objective good and bad, at least for Harris, not for the other new moral scientists, but there's kind of an aggressive tone. But that movement sort of imploded, and I think it was seen as too aggressive, and it was tethered, in some ways to the science of morality, and so that seemed to take it down to some extent. There are other issues too, but it's speculative.
Yeah.
Paul, what role does in this scientific endeavor to determine and maybe measure or maybe implement morality, which is for me the scariest part, does evolutionary psychology play? Do you see anything good in you talk about this a little bit in the book? Can you just elaborate a bit on its role, or do you see anything that we've gained by undertaking that kind of research?
Hypothetically, yes. So this is not something that James and I say, and I can't speak for him at this point. I mean, personally, I'm skeptical about the whole evolutionary paradigm. It grew out of an Enlightenment context where an explicit motivation was to find a non-theistic explanation for the development of life. This is a controversial subject, but that's where I stand. But if you think that evolution did play a major role, then yeah, I think that it had to develop somehow. And if you think that it developed apart from divine intervention, then there should be some intelligible natural process you can point to. And my sense is with those caveats, if you take on board those assumptions, some of the work in evolutionary psychology is really interesting, and they're pretty good hypotheses. They make arguments like, well, why might we care for our children? Well, because doing that helps our children survive and pass on our genes. This is a common argument. I think this bears little to no connection to our love and motivation and obligation to care for our kids. But you can see it's getting sort of the material pieces in the right place. And so there could be a connection on that basis. So
Okay, that's a question I still wrestle with. I think I have an answer, but I want to hear from you. What is it that sullies or taints the moral achievement of altruism if it's simply, or maybe not simply, if it's a survival and adaptation mechanism? I mean, I could see somebody who is like a theistic evolution or something who would say, well, that's just what God used to get us to altruism. But I've also read theologians who say, no, as soon as you say that it's not an ultimate good that you should pursue because of whatever reason, but it is an adaptive mechanism, that cheapens it, that sort of takes away its moral worth.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. One way to see part of the problem, I think, is to think about cases where, take paternal and maternal love, for instance, where these are not connected to genetic commonality. So if you have adopted children, for instance, you still hopefully love those children, and you ought to love them, even though there's really no specifically shared genetic material. I mean, you're both humans, so it's not furthering your genotype in any way to care for them. And so, those kinds of examples, there are others too. I think it's just thinking, well, why is, I don't even like the word altruism. I think it's a kind of a made up enlightenment virtue, but why is love for another a good thing? And I think it's because it's something to do with the transcendent value of the other person, and the biological altruist path sidesteps that and makes it about, well, this is how it had to happen, or else these organisms wouldn't exist. So yeah.
Is that the difference, like you make that difference that really stuck with me, of moral and biological altruism? That's the difference you're trying to get at.
That's right, yeah, right.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think that as soon as you mention love, I think it becomes more obvious. Because if you love somebody for whatever ulterior motive, whatever it is, and if it's adaptive, right away we know, like, that can't be love. Right? Yeah. So that somehow doesn't work.
Like if I'm affectionate toward my wife when I want her to do the dishes. She would see through that pretty quickly. This isn't love. This is manipulation.
Yeah.
So at its root, Paul, just to be as blunt as possible, you and James would basically say, science can't tell us anything about the good. Full stop.
Yeah, at a substantive level. I mean, it can tell us things like connected to it in those ways, like maybe it developed. Maybe our moral faculties developed this way. And here's what people think about morality, but no, in terms of what is good, what is bad, what is virtuous, what is not. No. Right.
Now, I think on the other side of this explanation and this kind of historical narrative that you've given us, it seems like a highly reasonable, if kind of almost self-evident claim that it's kind of a methodological category mistake to assume that science would be capable of such a thing. But I think nevertheless, and I think as we actually saw a little bit in some of the question and answer period last night, it's still a pretty striking claim to people. I'm curious about what are the cultural conditions that we're swimming in currently that would make such a claim, perhaps even on the other side of an explanation like the one that you've given, still
surprising,
quite disarming for folks.
This is just my best guess, but I think it's because more and more and especially in the academy and in student bodies at elite universities, I think we're inhabiting a materialist, instrumentalist, you might call it like a meritocratic ethos, where the good is just assumed to be personal success or maybe certain social goals we want to achieve. And for these kinds of projects, technical approaches obviously can succeed. And you can say, I want to be a consultant. What do I need to do to get this job? And then you find out, what are they looking for? I'll get this degree, I'll get this designation, I'll intern at these places, and you can reverse engineer the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so my suspicion is that if you're thinking about the good in these kinds of terms, then something like science obviously helps you achieve that.
Right.
And so I think there's kind of ships passing the night. There's been accidental change of subject in what the good and what the moral consists in,
Mm-hmm.
such that with this new change terms, something like science could help. That's my best guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find the most efficient way of doing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm.
Huh. So if science can't tell us anything about morality, truly, in its proper sense, then we're back to what? Philosophy, theology, religion?
I think we do not talk about this in the book. But speaking personally, I think you need to be a part of a long-standing tradition that can rely on accumulated wisdom to form you as you grow and develop, and teach you how to properly interpret your experience so that you can detect the good, so you can recognize when it appears, because it's easy to be distracted and to be focused on your own projects, like my own projects, and miss it. And so it's, I think, a cultural and moral education formation project that, well, as a Christian, ideally it would be coming from a historic Christian perspective. But I think it needs to be this teaching us to properly interpret things and to recognize the good and where obligations occur and what the virtues are and how to pursue.
Yeah, but now you're back then also to the religious differences that originally science claimed to be overcoming. And you say this really interesting thing in the book I wanted to pick up on is you said also religions didn't live very comfortable with differences, would rather have controlled them or subdued them or eliminated them.
Sure. Yeah.
And then you say, so the way forward is not by eliminating difference, but to actually discuss and talk about morality and arrive at some consensus, perhaps through our differences. How would that work?
Yeah, I think it couldn't be a universal consensus, just because I think the differences are too deep. And so James is my thought, and he really his spent a lot more time thinking about these political matters, and I'm strongly influenced by him on these points. But the thought would be the best that we can think that can be done is to recognize the differences, but look for points of commonality. Mm-hmm. So there will not be any sort of discovery that unites everyone in every way, but there will be common cause here and there. We were talking earlier about how, as Western society increasingly secularizes, there's sort of these new and surprising points of affinity between different traditional religions, mm-hmm. Between Muslims and Christians and religious Jews, that where before there may have been enmity over the differences, now that there was a recognition, well, we actually have more in common than we used to.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to hang on to this traditionally received religion, and it's difficult under these conditions. So mm-hmm. maybe we can collaborate in interesting ways. That would be something like that. Would be the hope.
So let me put this to you. So you could see that you could hold a religious tradition conviction sort of in your community, and then there's another community that has that too. So when we come together in the public, a common secular place, we need to be able to argue about these things, right? And you don't want to. So why do you argue? I had a colleague who made, I think, is a brilliant shorthand. There are two people in the world: the materialists and the Platonists. The materialists believe that there actually is no higher truth, that we try to approximate, and if we're humble enough, we say we're not there, but we're trying to approximate it. Therefore, I argue with you about it, because you could also, we argue because we realize there's something that we're arguing toward. The materialist has no such thing. So therefore, there's nothing to argue for. And in the end, you simply impose it, or because you can't argue, because there is no truth to argue about that you're standing under. So So it seems to me if we live in a world that has experienced a fundamental loss of that kind of a realism, that truth is actually something in the nature of things, toward which we need to conform and toward which we can argue, which we try to instantiate in our version of whatever the law of the land is and so on, but we realize it's not positive law, the positive laws try to be a reflection of a greater truth that is universally true, but we don't all have it, total, full 100%. That allows you to argue.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically the foundation of the academy, of the universities usually, but if you have a naturalist, let's use your term, right, mindset, then there is no such thing.
I like this. So you're kind of pointing, you're giving a transcendental argument for the universal norms of rationality.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I don't want to say funny, but it is kind of funny. There's one book that we look at. It's a part of this literature, this newer literature on the science of morality. Is this book by Alexander Rosenberg? He's at Duke, and the book is called "The Atheist's Guide to Reality." And he is the only naturalist that we encountered in our research who owned up to all the implications. Well, almost all of them. So he says everything is made out of material, and what are the implications of that? And he just starts going down the list: no free will, no soul, no self, no rationality, for the exact reason that you just gave.
Yeah.
And so you can't give arguments, because what does persuasion even mean? Because we don't have consciousness. That's an illusion. There's no intentionality. Our thoughts even aren't about things, because aboutness couldn't be explained by the material world. And in the end, you're wondering, well, why are you writing a book trying to convince us of this? It's very strange.
Right.
It's a performative self-contradiction without a recognition of the universal.
And I think in that sense, you and Hunter are right to call out when science becomes that kind of ideology. I mean, there's a moment of open confession or radical admission that that's the case. But there are also those that simply don't go there, and yet you have this kind of ethos within, let's say, a particular scientific community that is committed to naturalism to such an extent that when one of their own, I'm thinking of Thomas Nagel, for instance, whom you mentioned, who says, well, I'm an atheist. I'm committed to methodological naturalism, but I simply don't believe that naturalistic evolution can account for consciousness. And the next thing you see, that he's tied to a stake and burned up. I mean, I still remember, I think it was a Times magazine cover that had Nagel on a stake, and they burned him on the stake.
I didn't see that. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was very
But so there, now
yes.
you have, this is no longer pursuit of truth in the name of science. This is identity politics at its worst, right? Within a sort of supposedly research-oriented, truth-oriented enterprise.
Very little actual engagement with his arguments.
Yeah.
That's a great book, by the way. Mind and Cosmos is, in my opinion, the best work of metaphysics in the analytic tradition of the last 20 years. It's a fascinating book.
Paul, I think it's certainly the case in my personal experience that this kind of, let's call it faith, that science could kind of tell us what's right and wrong, I think on a certain level that's still very pervasive within popular consciousness. If you kind of talk to your average person, they might come up with some kind of answer. If you put it to them in kind of indifferent or kind of dispassionate terms, they might say, yeah, that makes sense. At the same time, in recent years, there have been a lot of kind of efforts toward narrating kind of re-enchantment, right? That people are instinctively kind of seeing beyond the scientific, the natural, the material. Is this something that you see showing up? Does that sound plausible? And is that the sort of thing that is encouraging, worrisome? Is that maybe creating some of the conditions for the kind of intra-traditional dialogue that we were talking about before that actually seems like a pretty hopeful prospect?
It's a great question, and I'll speculate or tell you my take. I mean, the person you should ask is someone like Tara Isabella Burton, who's worked a lot on this. I probably, like both of you, I see these pockets of interest in various forms of re-enchantment cropping up, and there's a part of me that wants that. Mm-hmm. Thinking about like the classic Weberian understanding of disenchantment, the feeling, the sort of the phenomenology that everything you come in contact with, in principle, has a mechanical explanation. Yep. Even if you don't know it, like if someone does, it's mechanics all the way down. That takes away sort of the spirit, the elan vital of a lot of the world, if you buy into that. And that seems bleak and depressing, if that's how things are. So I think both I and plenty of others are interested in re-enchantment. A colleague of mine just wrote a book, Jackson Lears, who's an American historian, cultural historian, called Animal Spirits, and which I think he's very interested in the project of re-enchantment, and this is his way of showing a continuing interest in re-enchantment right through the most disenchanted parts of modernity. There's been this residual sense that there's something about human beings and animals that eludes mechanical scientific description. And a term that's often been used throughout the history, apparently, after reading this book, is animal spirits. So the interest is there. How pervasive is it? Is it growing? I wish that it were, I think.
Yeah.
There's good and bad disenchantment. So I wish the good kind was growing.
Re-enchantment.
Re-enchantment.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm skeptical that it's going to make a comeback. I think the sort of meritocratic instrumentalist ethos that we were talking about a little bit earlier, I think that's the dynamics that perpetuate that are so entrenched. I'm skeptical that a human desire for something spiritual by itself will be enough to overcome it. But I mean, this is just one man's opinion.
Sure.
If you guys have takes, I'd be curious to hear them.
Right.
I wonder. So one of the problems, I mean, in my profession as an academic within the universities, education institutions, is that the myopic view of science, that the narrowing of science to what's quantifiable, mathematically discernible or calculable, became universalized as that's what truth is. I mean, I think scientists themselves, at least those that are self-reflective to a high degree, have realized that doesn't work. I mean, I'm thinking of the work of Michael Polanyi, for instance, who has clearly demonstrated that's not how scientific discovery works and so on.
Personal knowledge.
Yeah. And yet we've been conditioned so long in this way to say, well, that's really what truth is because of established facts. Yet what we do in the humanities is simply sort of some kind of a subjective, impressionistic, completely societal dependent, arbitrarily, conventional truth, right? So, I mean, you've shown basic limitations of science, and I think what we should do, I mean, even if I wasn't a Christian, if I was a philosopher and somebody who loves literature and the arts, I would say, okay, now is the time, realizing these limitations, that we kind of fight back. We just proclaim, that science has at best like a 30% of reality under its observational lens, and the rest, I mean, 70% of beauty, justice, the whole bunch of things that regulate our everyday life can only be expressed in poetry, literature. In fact, religious language may be the best language of all to talk about the personal. You mentioned that before. I mean, that kind of science can obviously not get at it. So have you ever thought about that?
A bit. I mean, I think my only thought here is that I agree, and that I think the time is right for imaginative, positive presentations of this better way of proceeding. I think people are. I think this goes hand in hand with the incipient desire for re-enchantment, and that people are tired of the naturalistic, scientistic approach. And if attractive alternatives can be presented, I think.
And it doesn't have to be fairies, right? I mean, you could just start with the mystery of the human being.
Yeah.
And I think the science, this kind of very reductive view of science or scientism, what it said is, we do facts, we don't do imagination. And I think we have to come back and say, well, in fact, you do have an imagination. It's just very poor. It's just very atrophied. It's minuscule. It can't even think of a lot of these things. It can't even have a conception of that are so important. Therefore, you have to sideline them. And that's what I think you see in the kind of moral science. That's what scares me. If this project is ongoing, or if this project continues to draw funding, and you have this kind of transhumanistic reiteration of it, that then you start to technologically design morality, technologically control morality, which could be terrible.
Oh yeah. I mean, it would make for a good episode of the TV show Black Mirror.
Yeah,
something like that. Kind of a dystopian. Maybe they've done it. I haven't seen all the episodes, but yeah, where we start tinkering with the human moral faculties. I can't imagine the implications.
Yeah. Well, speaking of dystopia, we talked a little bit this morning in our seminar with other Regent students about what you describe or term LCD, lowest common denominator culture. And for you, Paul, this is really setting the agenda and maybe sort of reciprocally reinforced by and reinforcing the plausibility of a kind of science of morality. So maybe we could kind of transition to that. Could you just describe the cultural condition you were talking about that you termed LCD and the various kind of institutional forces that are converging to produce this kind of attitude? So what is the attitude and how are we getting there?
Yeah.
Can I reshape the question just a little bit? So because the LCD is like the result that you arrive at. But before that, as you do in the other book, you have a nice description of something. And I find that description compelling.
Like the story of how we got
there.
The
story of how we got there. And you say that the disappearance of Christian morality in modern culture, people say, well, how that happened. It happened through the intelligentsia, the 18th, 19th, 20th century atheists, secularists who were in educational institutions, in the academies. Those ideas filtered down and change our imagination, and therefore you have disenchantment, and you have it. So, but you give a complementary or perhaps even competing account. You can comment on that, where you say no, it was actually sociocultural practices, like practical ways in which we have to or decided to lead lives that contribute at least an equal amount, if not more. And I found that really fascinating.
And especially ways that we negotiate common life seems to be at the core of it. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that both explanations are playing a role. For the intellectual account of I usually say secularization of morality, common morality. Christian Smith's book, A Secular Revolution, he has these 2 long intro chapters that are, I think, really great, kind of describing this sort of intellectual activism in the 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries. But yeah, my sense is that this can't account for everything. I'm not alone in thinking this, but it seems to me there's this phenomenology, there's this feeling, it's an experience of reality that no longer jibes with the Judeo-Christian morality, and that does not apparently come from intellectual argument, because it's accessible to everyone, not just those who've gone to Harvard or whatever. And so I hang out with social theorists a lot, and I'm trying to steal some of their moves, and they have me reading their books, and so this is my attempt to weave together some philosophy and some social theory to explain, well, why has there been this big sea change in popular morality that goes beyond the intellectual factors? And the theory that I propose, it goes something like this. There are some distinctive dynamics in modernity, some socioeconomic dynamics that I think are the engine for this change. One of them is urbanization as arising from the Industrial Revolution. So prior to this, most people lived an agrarian lifestyle, family units, an extended family living in the same village community for centuries, living life together, a part of the same deep religious tradition. Due to technological changes in capitalism, the Industrial Revolution took place where we built machinery that could do the work of 20 farmers, and one farmer could do it. So there was this huge change in efficiency, and so the agrarian lifestyle became untenable pretty quickly, and people had to move from these agrarian lifestyles to work at these factories in urban centers. And what this led to is pluralism, because you have this disembedding, uprooting effect where people are drawn from these from the provincial lifestyle into an urban context, where now they're being confronted by people with different belief systems, coming from other traditions who are also uprooted, and put this all in the mix of a liberal political order where the society is run, in some sense, by the will of the governed, by the citizens, and so you can contend in the public sphere for what you think is the right way to order society. So you're sort of pulled into confrontation with those who disagree with you. So these elements working together, I think they created this sort of combination of currents that caused people to look for what's shared, for what's held in common. Maybe I'm at the time when it started, maybe I'm a Catholic and maybe you're a Protestant, and so we don't agree on some important things. But we can agree on certain things, and everybody can agree on the instrumentally useful, technology, status, money. And over time, as the pluralism deepened through immigration and globalization, more and more, what was held in common, I think, and what is held in common are these instrumental goods. And so previously, the instrumental goods were just that. They were instrumental. They were oriented toward the achievement of these transcendent and deeper, richer goods. But living in these conditions of modernity, more and more, our focus, our attention is shifted toward what's held in common as greater currency and economic competitive advantage. And eventually, I submit, we're at the point now where plenty of people don't have a deeper transcendent good they draw on. They're purely creatures of this lower common denominator culture, and the fundamental goods for them are what we would have called instrumental goods before. It is money, status, technology, just the tools themselves.
And that's the lowest common denominator culture.
That's what I'm calling. Yeah, I think meritocratic ethics could work, or maybe neoliberalism. These are cognates, kind of getting at some of the same phenomenon. But
I found that fascinating. So that lowest denominator culture has its own ethics. It develops its own kind of ethics. Can you describe what is that? Ethics?
Yeah, and I'm way outside of my expertise here, but it's, just from playing the armchair, ethnographer, what I see in my students, and I guess even in myself, is, well, one, we make decisions oriented by this chain of values. If you choose when you're 18 years old to stay in your small hometown so you can be near your family and friends instead of going to a good university, most people see that as you making a practical mistake. Mm-hmm. And I think that suggests a change in the underlying ethos. But also, in talking with students, I've been surprised in the last few years to hear the way they narrate their experience of these conditions. And they first of all, they say, yes, I know that I should be studying much more than I am so that I can achieve much more than I am. But I find it difficult to do this, and so I'm failing. And they feel guilt. And the moral emotions, they're having the moral emotions associated with failure to live up to this meritocratic ethos. And so I think it has become this morality, in a sense. Mm-hmm. It's formally a morality. And they have their versions of the goods, but they're not really transcendent goods.
And if I heard you correctly in our earlier discussions, that was also fascinating to me. So we could potentially be, so we happen to be a Christian institution, but you could be a good Platonist or a good Stoic or whatever, right? There's certain transcendent moral values of some sort. You could be talking about that up here all you want, but actually, in fact, you're so immersed in this lower common denominator culture, like this culture that forces you into these necessities, right? Into that kind of instrumental ethics.
I think that's exactly right. Here am I judging the people who inhabit lowest common denominator culture, but what have I done with my life? I don't live in my hometown. I left. I pursued graduate degrees and moved where I could find work, and living the life of a cosmopolitan elite, in a way. So I think it's exactly right. And many of us say we value these certain things, but then.
So if then this is fascinating. So if then, is there an iron cage that's so rigged that even if I want to say, look, I don't want to I want to rescue my neighbor. I don't want to sacrifice my neighbor. If I sacrifice him, I could make a career advance. Yeah, sure, I could. Yeah, but you know what? Like, I'll do the career advance. Is the system so rigged? Are the pressures so strong? And if they are, how do we resist? Like, how do you resist that? If supposedly that's not morally good for us, right, to be in that sort of culture, how do we get out of it? How do you resist it?
This is where I'm at my weakest. But my one thought would be, ideally, the church should be playing a large role here, teaching us to walk as Christ does, to love our neighbor. And Christ had there was a role for money, but it was to care for your friends. It was not an end in and of itself. And I think the church could be speaking into this point in our point in time, pushing back against these meritocratic currents and saying, you need to stay with us, this local body of Christ, where you form relationships, be faithful. This should at least enter into the decision calculus when you're deciding what job to take. I think it's, for many people, and probably often for myself, it's almost unthinkable. It just doesn't even come up. It's like, oh, you could go where the money is.
Now, is that?
But I don't have much to say there.
Yeah. Is that to say, Paul, that you feel as if various church communities, or just church communities, and we're here in British Columbia, you live in the United States, in Virginia, is the church failing, succeeding? What's your observation along these lines? Is it providing an actual alternative to just kind of filing in and capitulating to these demands?
I can't speak to that. I don't think I have a representative feel for the American church. What I can say is, just from personal experience, how much I've learned from living in community with the people in my church, people that I wouldn't know otherwise. I mean, without being a part of my church, I would mostly probably be friends with my colleagues at the university. But I encounter very different, people from different walks of life, who are, many of whom are living faithful lives in invigorating, exemplary ways that I'm encouraged by. And I think in my own church, the pastorate is doing a good job too. But it's these relationships with other Christians in the body of Christ, who are living it out, that have helped me, and I hope that many church bodies can boast that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's a bit of a theme, and we're coming to the end of our time, so we'll probably just have time for a couple more questions. There's a bit of a theme that's emerged where, in your sort of your narrative of, on the one hand, how LCD culture emerged, but also one of the kind of main symptoms is a sense of uprooting from common communities, right? So on the one hand, urbanization draws people away from, say, like a village kind of context, and on the other, one of the chief examples that you've used is people who are not staying close to their local communities and are going off to XYZ university to chase ABC job, and on and on and on. So could you just I kind of get the sense that there's an importance to rootedness and place that you would suggest as a kind of resistance. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I agree with that characterization. The best I can say is to encourage people to read Peter Berger's book, The Homeless Mind. He talks about these modern dynamics, and he and his co-authors in the book. And he focuses more on the implications for the individual and the sense of identity. That part of what is lost or sacrificed in this uprooting process is who you are is no longer as easily defined by the relationships you stand in to other people, because it's all negotiable. You're no longer so-and-so's son and so-and-so's grandson, and your identity is no longer conferred. It has to be earned or created. And so Is this speaking to your question?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And I mean, this is of signal importance, and it captures much of our moment, where many of us are in this active process of identity creation because we live in a context where it isn't given to us, and there's a freedom that's part of that. I mean, you can be anything you want within some limits, but then there's all the attendant challenges that come with that, the paralysis of near infinite choices, and how do you, this is something I talk about with my students. Part of what an identity ideally gives you is a sense of a moral scale, where you fit into the scheme of things and what's important. So if you're trying to decide that, you're trying to make a value decision without a standard of value. It's a terrible predicament. It's kind of like the existentialists talk about in some cases. It's a similar conundrum.
One of the connectors, that connects us supposedly to community globally, that sort of transcends the communal boundaries that you're talking about, is social media. Social media, good or bad for what you're trying to express here? Is it a contributing factor? Can it be a helpful counter?
I don't feel competent to speak with finality on the issue. Just from the gut, it's not helpful. Speaking personally, my experience with Facebook and other forms of social media has been uniformly bad for me. I'm trying to, it enables you to stay in touch with people that you couldn't hear from otherwise, but it just seems in so many ways the conversations have become destructive. On Twitter or X and on Facebook, oftentimes there's sort of the attention economy motivates certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of posts. And I would often observe back when I was on Facebook that angry tirades about this or that generated the most interest and attention. And so that creates an economy where there's an incentive to react that way. And something similar I think is often true on X. These are non-ideal, but there are also good things. I mean, news, it's interesting that you can oftentimes get a certain kind of perspective on current news events by looking at social media and seeing, maybe even live footage of what's happening on the ground, as long as it's not a deep fake. We have new challenges to face. But so it's not all bad, but I don't feel really qualified to pronounce on it. These are just
there seems to be a near uniform recognition, I think, among my peers. I don't think anybody thinks this kind of immersion in social media is good. There seems to be a widespread recognition that no, in fact, it's bad. And I think that actually speaks quite powerfully to the argument that you're making regarding LCD culture. There's something that's perceived as almost mandatory or compulsory about participation in the social media landscape, despite the widespread recognition that maybe this is really taking a toll on my site.
Is it a form of FOMO? Like what is the mandatory?
Well, I'm not on social media, so I shouldn't. Can't speak to it. But I suppose there's a certain what would you say, ephemeral economic cachet to being able to represent yourself to your peers in certain ways. I mean, these are cliches at this point, but again, the fact that they're cliche, widely recognized as problematic, and yet as sort of captivating as ever, I think, like I said, speaks pretty powerfully to the diagnosis that you're giving us of the phenomenology of late modernity.
I mean, if you take it one step down from social media, you still stay on the internet. I mean, how will you function in our current, lowest common denominator culture of commerce and economics? Internet banking, internet access to your parking app, internet access to this, internet access to that. Like you need that thing to function. So that keeps it alive, right, within the system. So you can't tell you how often I'm the idiot out there who doesn't have the parking app, or who is standing in front of a hotel and you have an I key, but you can't go in because you can't for parking. You're afraid that your car will get towed because you can't download the proper app on your iPhone because your iPhone is too old and you didn't buy a new one. I mean, it's like an iron cage, And then I'm thinking, I'm only, approaching 60. Like, what if somebody was 90 and has never? I mean, you're left out. So
it's not like this in the smaller towns like where I live. So this is a little
right.
scary.
So which is an interesting.
It's coming for me too.
It's an interesting urbanization connector, right?
Right?
Because I think a lot of this dream that everything is interconnected and therefore helpfully interconnected, but actually turning into an iron cage of access or no access, is an urban dream. Like it works perhaps in a city, but it doesn't work in more rural areas unless you turn them into cities. I mean, we don't want that. My final question for you is working in the academy, and we're here a Christian institution, but I'd like to think more generally about education, Christian or non-Christian. So are we sunk then, in terms of the kind of liberal arts ideal of education, formation through education, and so on? Because I remember distinctly reading the history of the universities. Once the universities began to be funded more and more by business people, you sometimes even had sort of business people in administration, business people in the presidency, which was also a new thing. Like, if presidents of universities used to have principally, sort of a more, PhDs and so on. They would become a director or whatever you used to call it, or principal. And now you have these, you could see it, how it becomes a job factory. You get the degree to get a job. You don't get the degree, you don't go there to study literature, poetry, or philosophy, to think critically. You want a job at the end, that's what you want. And even those humanities department, they are justifiable only because they give you a little bit of critical thinking while you do the real thing, which is professional training or getting a job. You could see that if we wanted to change that, certain funders might pull out and might say, I mean, do you think our institutions are done, our educational institutions?
No, I mean,
are we sunk in the lowest common denominator?
I mean, my opinion is that, strangely, because of kind of maybe the intensification of some of these instrumental objectives for education, we've reached a point of crisis or decision where I think the goal of education will have to be clarified, and I think this could be good. I mean, my sense is that up until recently, many schools were trying to do both. They were trying to retain the humanities and the liberal arts, the humanistic social sciences, but at the same time, advertise it as being helpful for the students to get jobs. Philosophy grad schools love showing these little charts, like, oh, look how philosophy bachelor's degree graduates perform on the LSAT. These kind of like instrumentalizations of the degree. Yeah. But now, and I think especially because of AI, largely, making it so easy for students to write the papers they would have had to have written in a more liberal arts education, I think colleges and universities are going to face and are facing a decision. Why are we having them do these things? If it's just to be functional in the job market, they don't need to write them anymore. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They can have ChatGPT do it in 5 seconds. Yeah. Or is there actually another reason we were doing this that we've lost sight of? And I think different schools will take different answers on this, but I think plenty of them will say, no, there is something valuable about the development of the human capacities to think, to create, to write a sentence, to express themselves, to observe the good in the world, to articulate it, and to interpret reality. And the schools that take that path, I think there will be an interest. Maybe not all of the business industrial complex will support that, but I think plenty will, because I think about the people who fund the institute that I work at, and they're mostly businessmen who are interested in the world and ideas, and they a part of them wishes they could have pursued these things, and so they want to promote. I think there's enough people with these means and a different sort of background, but who are still interested in the traditional telos of education, or teloses, where I don't think we're sunk, but I think there's going to be a time of winnowing. Mm-hmm. What does this institution stand for? And that is pure speculation, but I can see universities having to decide.
Yeah, and it might be a painful transition, surely, but maybe worth kind of gritting the teeth and kind of pushing through to a new horizon.
I think
ideally.
So. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good note of hope to end on. I had a colleague who said he wrote a book on universities and said universities used to be about what you spend your money on, and now all they're about is how do you make money. But maybe we can return, to the wisdom thing. What's actually worth living for? What should you spend the money on? What's the morally good that you should invest in? So thank you very much for coming. You've given us a lot to think about, and thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you for the next interview.
Thank you, Jens. Thank you, John.